You're right. One of the things I try very hard to do in the book is to preserve that moment of the Maidan as it was experienced at the time, and kind of bracket or try to capture the experience of those people, bracketing the knowledge of what comes afterwards. The annexation of Crimea, and then the war in the East, the uncertainty in the East, the violence in the East, which has now become the war in the Donbass. And that war is a tragedy for many reasons. George Orwell says that that every revolution is a failure in its own way, and Tolstoy says that every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way, and every war is a tragedy in its own way. And among the many ways that the war in the Donbass is a tragedy is that it didn't allow the whole society to kind of take hold of and absorb and evaluate what the Maidan meant, because they were immediately thrown into, a situation of Ukraine having to defend itself, against an aggressive attack, through a combination of separatist and Russian forces, and the questions now that have come up that are so salient about national identity and, anti-colonialism, are very much, of course, influenced by the fact that this is a country that's under invasion.
And if we then, if we're speaking about as a modern historian who really looked at this region, not just in Eastern Europe, not just in Ukraine, there is this vicious circle of the perception of the revolution by the media. At the beginning, there are very much of the excitement, and later there is kind of a natural disappointment. And the higher were the emotions, the more were at stake, the tougher is it later. So really, if you speak about your characters and your book, how do you see, and also how, as a historian, you think we can live with this understanding of, that maybe that excitement, that moment, would be perceived as something very naive?
I see that moment, very much as really what Hannah Arendt described as the treasure of revolution beyond victory or defeat. And I think, for instance, what my friends who are much older than I am in Poland, who were formed by Solidarity, what they saw in the Maidan is that they understood that kind of ecstatic moment of self-sacrifice, of solidarity, of the transcendence of previously existing boundaries, of the coming together of the right and the left, and the Marxists and the Catholics and the workers and the intellectuals, that kind of solidarity is fragile, it's precarious, it can never be sustained. I mean, in Poland, it lasted 30 seconds after communism fell. But those people also understood that it was that extraordinarily precious experience that most people never see in their lifetimes, that suggests that we have a human capacity for that, even if it can't easily be sustained. To come back to your previous question, now that I'm thinking about it for another 30 seconds, one of the things that I'm far away from Ukraine, so I can't judge well, but that seems so sad to me, and a kind of additional tragedy watching the war in the Donbass, is just how relations between Ukrainians and Russians have deteriorated. Which I think was not true in the Maidan. I think that anti-Russian feeling was not true in the Maidan. I think that the Maidan was about self-determination. It wasn't about ethnicity or nationality first and foremost. It was about not being ruled by gangsters. It was a revolt against proizvol. I try in the book very hard to translate proizvol and its kind of long tradition, in East European history into English, and I don't quite come up with an adequate translation. But it was that we want to be treated as subjects and not as objects. We don't want to be ruled by gangsters. We don't want to be the helpless playthings of the brutality of the people in power. And it was not, it seems to me, anti-Russian. And it was not, anti-Russian language, and it was not, against one's friends and colleagues in Russia, and the war in the Donbass, has, I think, done terrible things to relations between Ukrainians and Russians on both sides. I mean, I think for many of the people I knew who were on the Maidan, I think their feelings about Russians while they were on the Maidan was in some sense this hope that that the Maidan could be an example.
Marci, as a historian also, how do you explain that, the cause and the consequence? Because it happened the annexation of Crimea happened more or less right after. And then there was very, very fast consequence of the events followed by the war. And then when you today read a short summary of what happened, there was a Maidan and there was a war. And, the war, Maidan is described as the reason. So we can actually argue that, the war itself was a kind of a counter-revolution to the Maidan, and the part of the ideology of the Kremlin is in fact to prove that don't go to the streets, that would lead to the war, and will prove in any case that. And to some extent they succeed with that message. They definitely succeeded to throw it to the post-Soviet world, but maybe to some extent even to the international world, that there is this disappointment with the public gathering which can lead to the chaos. How as a historian you think we should treat and really explain that sequence in order not to lead to some tricky summary, tricky explanation?
Well, I think you're right that Putin decided to start that war. He instigated that war. There were local elements, and he found, local allies, and he found people who, either for mercenary reasons or for reasons of authentic inclination were willing to go along with it. But there would not have been a war if Putin hadn't instigated it. And in that sense, I think that was outside of the control of the people on the Maidan to control what Putin was doing. I mean, the point you make that, Putin said if you go out on the streets, it will lead to war, and then he starts a war, and so it proves, in retrospect, his claim. That's a kind of classic move. And Hannah Arendt has this wonderful, section in part 3 of Origins of Totalitarianism, and she talks about how, those creating totalitarian ideology always have the advantage of logical consistency, because what they are doing is forcing the world to conform, to the logic of their vision. So Putin says if you go on the streets, there will be a war. If you try to have a revolution, there will be a war. And then he starts a war, therefore making his prediction come true. In a sense, that's a kind of classic totalitarian move. He's creating the world to fit in with the worldview that he's proffering. Which Arendt says is always the advantage, that those propagators of ideology have, because they can force reality to conform to the ideas they set forth, through violent measures. I don't know how the Maidan or the people on it could have defended themselves against that. I mean, certainly there was the element of the hybrid war, there was the element of post-truth, there was the element of disinformation. In the Donbass. And I know people like Serhiy Zhadan, were running around there, just trying to talk to people. That 6-minute video that he made during the so-called Russian Spring, in which he just stands there straightforwardly talking to the camera, and says we are not fascists. None of that is true. Come over to our side. I think is one of the most, poignant moments ever kind of captured on video of Serhiy, and he's not performing in any way. He's just speaking straightforwardly into the camera to his fellow people in Kharkiv, and said, and saying, don't be afraid of us. We're not extremists. We're not fascists. Please don't believe it. It's not true. It's not true. And, there were people like that who were trying very, very hard. But it turned out not to be enough. And I don't know what would have made it enough.